In the NHL, teams aren't just worried about this upcoming season, but about the ones to come.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. My name is Nick Zararis, one of the host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the hosts of Locked On Penguins. We want to thank everybody who makes Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So today's show, we are going to be power ranking teams' futures over the next 5 seasons. Hunter and I are going to get into the criteria, how we graded them. We're going to do our best to stay on topic and keep it moving because this is going to be a rather long-winded episode. So I'm going to break it down for you guys. My criteria was very straightforward. I had it broken down into 6 categories. Number 1, this upcoming season, how likely they are to be good this upcoming season, how good their star players are, how good their depth is, how good their prospect pool is, and how much cap flexibility they have. Those are the criteria I graded the teams out on. Hunter, what were you looking for when you were putting your list together?
I was also looking for, how good will they be this year? But I was also just mainly looking into future seasons as well. I think I put more weight into that overall, which is why some of Nick and I's rankings, especially in the top 10, might be a little bit different. Yes, the season matters, but I was mainly looking for the next, 3 to 4 seasons overall and where the team will be in the next 3 to 4 years compared to where they will be at the end of this year. I also looked at management groups, just how confident I am in that front office to execute said plan. And I looked at prospects and I looked at cap space.
Okay, so without further ado, Hunter, you and I are relatively the same at the top and relatively the same at the bottom. So let's start with number 32. Who do we think is going to be in really rough shape 5 years from now?
5 years from now, I hate saying this to make the fine folks of Long Island upset, but I really am not bullish on the Islanders in 5 years from now. Heck, I'm not really bullish on them this season that much, Nick. I think their ceiling for this year is a playoff team like they were this past year, but I don't think they're going to do that much damage unless they get the right matchup. The last couple of years, they just really haven't had the right matchup. They played a Hurricanes team that plays kind of like them, but they have at least more finishing than the Islanders. I think the Islanders, I love Matt Barzal. I love Noah Dobson, but I just don't like the plan that Lamoriello has. He just kind of has the middling overall. And 5 years from now, their core players right now will be older. Some of these other players will be gone, but I just don't really see a good long-term plan for the Islanders. They need to pick a direction. And right now, Nick, they're not really doing that.
So I'm going to be brief. I agree. I have the Islanders 32nd as well. Their good players are good. They don't have any young players in the pipeline ready to assume roles, and they are going to need to spend money to supplement their core as Barzal, as Horvat, as Noah Dobson, as Sorokin. As those guys get older, you will need to spend money, and they don't have a ton of cap space right now because they have tied up money in some lower caliber players. Number 31, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins. Whenever Sidney Crosby retires, it is going to be a full-scale post Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews type teardown in Pittsburgh. You imagine Letang and Malkin will follow shortly after Crosby retires. And hey, you had the best run of the 21st century. You're going to have to take your lumps.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I have Pittsburgh a little further up, not much, but I definitely understand why you have them at 31. Number 31 for me, this might ruffle some feathers a little bit as well. I have the Calgary Flames right there. I'm just not sold on Craig Conroy's plan so far. I don't think the Flames are going to be any good this year. And honestly, Nick, I don't think they're going to be that good for the next 3 to 4 years anyway. This roster, when you look at it, it's not deep. There's not a lot of, high superstar talent there like it used to be. And I just don't trust Conroy enough to execute said plan. Yeah, they'll have some cap space. We talked before we went live how their prospect pool is at least deeper than some other teams, but I am just not bullish on their future.
Entirely reasonable. They're pretty. I have a different outlook on the Calgary Flames, but we'll get to them when we get to them. For me, number 30, I have the Washington Capitals, relatively similar to Pittsburgh. When Ovechkin finally hangs it up, Backstrom is probably a medical retirement. TJ Oshie very well might be a medical retirement. And their supporting cast is not awful. Like, I like Dylan Strome. I like the moves they made this offseason for Jacob Chikrin, taking a chance on Pierre-Luc Dubois. Charlie Lindgren kind of came out of nowhere, but long term, they don't really have the high-end pieces you need to be seriously competitive. Can they be a fringe playoff team when their best player is a Jacob Chikrin? Maybe, but that's really about it.
Right. I have Pittsburgh number 30 on my list. I think the Penguins, they're kind of trying to do two things at once here. They're trying to, please the core players while also looking toward the future and doing this quote unquote rebuild on the fly, where they're not going to basically tear it down to the shreds, but they want to make sure there's not as much pain when the core retires. But no matter what happens, Nick, when these three retire, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, Sidney Crosby, there is going to be pain. The team is not a contender right now. And even in 5 years, I don't know if they'll be a contender. That might be the start of maybe them getting back to potentially being a playoff team if they do everything right. But I still don't see a very bright future these next 5 years overall for the Penguins.
Next up for me at number 29. This might surprise some people. I have the Boston Bruins. I like David Pastrnak. I like Charlie McAvoy. I like Jeremy Swayman. Beyond that, that is a very old and a very expensive team. When Marchand hangs it up, you're not going to replace Brad Marchand's 100 points leadership. And McAvoy will be fine as captain, and I'm sure they'll be a playoff team. But long-term, their outlook, they have no prospects to speak of note. They've graduated anybody who's relatively useful. I just don't see a long-term vision there. They have been managing all in to be all in for basically a decade now. And because of that, they just don't have any reinforcements on the horizon. They are old. They are expensive. Their stars are very good. And I'm sure they might be a playoff team, but I can't imagine that team being a Stanley Cup contender 5 years from now.
See, I have the Bruins a bit higher up on my list just because I think they're still going to be a playoff team throughout these next few years. And I think that, definitely holds some weight for me overall. 29 for me, I do have the Washington Capitals. You can't have the Penguins at the bottom without the Capitals just because they're both on, I think, pretty similar trajectories overall. A few years from now, Ovechkin's not going to be with the team anymore. Nicholas Backstrom's going to be retired. I have to imagine TJ Oshie will be retired at that point. Heck, Nick, Oshie might retire before the season if his back doesn't get it together. John Carlson, we'll have to see how he's still playing, but he's still, when he's on, he's very good. This will be the next wave for the Capitals. I do like what Brian McClellan has been doing, stockpiling assets, getting Jacob Chikrin, some of the other moves like Andrew Mangiapane to at least be a playoff team for Ovechkin's final couple of years under contract. But after these top core guys go, they're just not going to have in the way of, quote unquote, elite talent on this team. So I just don't think, in terms of being a contender, let alone maybe a playoff team, even 3 to 4 years from now after Ovechkin leaves, that this is going to be a playoff team.
Completely agreed. I'm going to give you the next few I have because we are going a little bit too slow. Number 28, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning. That core is very old. Once Kucherov hits his mid-30s, Hedman's already kind of there. Vasilevsky's already kind of there. I have the St. Louis Blues at 27, kind of a similar boat to some of the teams we've discussed where they've got some nice pieces, they've got some good players, but not really championship caliber pieces, no young pieces along the way. And then after that, I have the Detroit Red Wings, who we are still waiting for to break through and have already kind of aged out and spent a lot of money in preventing them from really kind of improving their roster that much. Then after that, I have the LA Kings, who are on the older side already and already kind of expensive. Byfield may be something, Laferriere may be something, but other than that, I don't see a Stanley Cup caliber team. I don't really even see a playoff team whenever Drew Doughty and Anze Kopitar do finally hang it up.
Right. 28, I do have Detroit as well, just because I got to see something from the Yzer plan, man. I mean, this has got to be coming to a head at some point. They missed the playoffs this year once again, Nick. I think he's gone from Detroit. Like, you got to start getting results, but I just don't know if that plan is also fully that good. Don't get me wrong. I love Lucas Raymond. I think he's one of the most underrated players in the NHL, but it's time to start getting results. But I just don't know if the Red Wings are going to do that. 27, I'm right there with you with the Blues. They kind of seem like another very middling team to me. Like, they're not really committing one direction or another, kind of similar to the Islanders in a way, right? They're kind of committing to maybe being a playoff team while Doug Armstrong is the GM for the next couple of years before he hands it over to Alexander Steen, which, I mean, God, I'm getting old. The fact that Alexander Steen's going to be a general manager in the NHL. but I have St. Louis at 27. This will ruffle some feathers, Nick. 26, I have Buffalo. Don't get me wrong, people. Their future should be bright, but I am just not sold on that management group, man. I really, just with Kevin Adams overall, I just don't really like the moves or some of the moves that he's been making over the last couple of years. I'm not sold on Lindy Ruff as the head coach. I would have them higher if their management group was a bit better. I love Tage Thompson. I love some of their other younger players, especially Rasmus Dahlin. But I'm sorry, I feel like I've been duped by Buffalo so many times. I'm kind of in the I'll believe it when I see it when it comes to Buffalo with them. And then after that, I have the LA Kings just because I don't really know. Again, kind of like Buffalo, Nick, I just don't really know what the full plan is with Rob Blake. It seems like he's also kind of trying to do two things at once, but he's also not fully going all in terms of being a contender. He's lost to the Oilers multiple years in a row, but it doesn't seem like he wants to do anything about it for his overall team. And, Doughty's getting older, Kopitar's getting older. What's going to happen to them, or what's going to happen to this team, once they eventually phase out and retire? I just don't really see too many, strong building blocks overall there. So that's why I have the LA Kings next up after Buffalo. But I know Buffalo, I'm going to ruffle some feathers with for sure.
Definitely. Hunter and I are going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and we're going to keep making headway on our list. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On NHL. It is summer, which means barbecues, the beach, hot dogs, and of course, baseball and concerts. And if you want to get to a baseball game or get to a show this summer, the only place I buy tickets, I will be at Yankee Stadium tomorrow to see them play the Blue Jays. I got my tickets from our friends over at Gametime with some of the best ticket buying features in the business. Things like zone deals where you choose a section and let Gametime choose the seats. All-in pricing, where they show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime has the best customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying baseball or concert tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on TV all day, you probably got to turn the volume down with all that yelling. If you're like us, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube with the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hunter, your turn.
So for my next team on my list, this is a team that I feel like should be good in 5 years, but I'm just not, again, fully confident in it. And that's the Anaheim Ducks, Nick. I know you may have them maybe similar on your list or maybe a little further above, but I'm just not fully sold on them. I definitely drank the Kool-Aid a little bit a couple of years ago when they got off to that great start, and I was like, oh, it looks like the rebuild's over, but then they kind of went down a little bit. Then this past season, they weren't good again. I just, with Pat Verbeek, he does some things that I'm like, wow, this is really good. But then there's other things where I'm like, okay, not really sure what you're doing here. I'm just not sure if the core they have in place is going to figure it out. And with Verbeek just kind of being wishy-washy with me at times, I have the Ducks at 24. That they can definitely go up, especially if they're able to go out there this season and be better than last year and in future years. But I'm just not sure I'm fully sold yet on this overall core with the Ducks.
I agree with you. I have the Ducks 24th as well. I like their young guys, but I'm not wholly convinced of their young guys' ability to get to that kind of superstar tier that you kind of need to get out of this extended rebuilding period. After the Ducks, coming up at 23, I have the Minnesota Wild. Even though I like some of their young pieces, I struggle to see a world where they're going to be able to capitalize on on Kaprizov, basically. And once Kaprizov kind of gets to that early 30s stage, maybe he maintains that through his mid 30s, but you like Faber, you got to figure out goalie long term. But once you get past those, Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, those guys are all nice, solid pieces. But I just, without a strong supporting cast, without that quality, without another quality superstar caliber player, I struggle to imagine them getting out, even though they have some cap flexibility that they're going to be able to make some things happen with in the not so distant future. Next up, after them, I have the Vegas Golden Knights, who are old, who are expensive, will likely remain competitive for the foreseeable future, but without draft picks, without prospects, it's going to be a lot of reclamation projects and hoping Jack Eichel can stave off the aging process as Mark Stone, Alex Pietrangelo, and the older guys on that crew start to age out.
Yeah, that's fair. I have Vegas a little higher up just because I think these next couple of years are going to be really good for them, just with how they know how to win now. It's the future that I'm a little bit concerned about, but I don't have them in my top 10 or anything like that. Number 23 for me, I actually have Seattle a little further down than I think some people may have, just because with how Seattle's been so boom or bust since they got into the league. They made a lot of really big moves this offseason, but how much is that going to truly move the needle for them over the next few years? Don't get me wrong, Nick. I love Brandon Montour. I think he's a really good defenseman, but is he a true number one on that team? I'm a little skeptical of that. Also, with Chandler Stevenson, I don't think he is a true number one center in the NHL, but the Kraken are kind of paying him like a number one center, or at least a low end number one center overall. I just still want to see more from Ron Francis. I want to see more from this young core with Seattle as well. I'm still a little bit concerned about their goaltending at times as well. So I have Seattle at 23 on my list. Number 22, I have Minnesota right there with you. I'm just not fully sure what to make of them these next 5 years. I think Kaprizov's going to be great. I love the Brock Faber extension from Billy Guerin. I think that was really smart to lock him up when they did. I'm just not fully sure they're ever going to reach contender status. But I feel like I've been saying that for the last several years now. This is going back to even when, for example, the Blackhawks were great during their heyday with Kane and Taves. The Wild were just never able, I think, to fully get to being a Stanley Cup contender, at least in my eyes. And I'm not sure they're going to get to that point even these next 3 to 4 to 5 years. So I have Minnesota right after them.
Okay. After my last team, which was Vegas, I have at 21, I have Utah. I think Utah is in an okay position financially. I think they have an interesting prospect pool. But until I see them start turning that army of draft picks into actual players, and those actual players turning into stars and a solid supporting cast, and then they can start like boutique shopping for, oh, we need a third defenseman. Oh, we need a third line wing. I'm going to look at them with an air of skepticism. After them, at 20, I have the Maple Leafs. I have no reason to believe that Austin Matthews is going to fall off a cliff. I do think they are going to end up regretting whatever contract they give Mitch Marner, not because Mitch Marner is not a good player, but just because they're not going to be able to build out this roster. I am very skeptical of Brad Treliving putting together a roster based on how things went in Calgary. After the Maple Leafs, I have the Winnipeg Jets. While the Jets are in a good position in the immediate moment, you have to wonder what Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck are going to look like going forward. And while I like their supporting cast, we know they're not exactly bullish on Nikolai Ehlers, that if he's on the way out, and they have a lot of young guys I am enticed by, but the Jets have slow played all of them, and now they're kind of at a point where they need them to turn into something. And because they haven't turned into something yet, I'm skeptical that they ever will, or might be able to reach the ceiling that they were once potentially able to get to. After them, I have Calgary. Calgary's going to have all the flexibility in the world, and they have a lot of prospects. None I'm particularly high on, but they do have a lot of prospects. So the logic would tell you they can probably turn some of those guys into NHL caliber players. And then it'll simply be a matter of, can we turn these guys into something? Can we turn them into roster players, etc.? And then after Calgary, I have the Nashville Predators. I like the Predators core. Yossi, Saros, Forsberg will get you to the dance. They'll get you in the playoffs. But without a long-term sustainable plan of graduating guys other than maybe Askarov, I struggle to see how that team with Stamkos and Marchessault both in their mid-30s, Yossi over 30, Saros approaching 30, how they're going to be competitive long-term.
Oh, those are all very fair. I think for me, my next team on my list at 21, I actually have the Ottawa Senators. So kind of right in the middle, but just a little bit below it, I guess, as well. It's time for Ottawa, I think, to show me something this year and in just future years as well. I love the Linus Ullmark trade. I think he's hopefully going to finally answer their questions in terms of goalie wise, but it's time, Nick, for a lot of the younger players to, take that next step. I want to see a little bit more from Brady Tkachuk. I want to see a bit more from Shabbat, Tim Stützle, etc. I want to see Ottawa finally push for a playoff spot this year. I think this team can definitely be a playoff team in the next 3 to 4 years, but until they actually make it, I have to fully see it to believe it, I think, at this point. And I think the jury is still out on this Ottawa front office. I don't think it's going to be, the quote unquote mess that you saw at times with the last front office, but the jury is still out at least a little bit for me with this front office. Next up on my list, I have the Winnipeg Jets. Everything went right for the Jets this past season. Hellebuck was great. Their forwards were great. They got good contributions from their defensemen as well. But I just don't think that's going to happen again this year. And when I think it doesn't, I think their future is going to be a little bit clouded as well. So I have Winnipeg at 20 there. I'm also, again, not the highest on Kevin Cheveldayoff, but he also just doesn't do anything that much either. 19, I have Columbus. I would have them a bit lower if Jarmo Kekalainen was still the general manager, but because Don Waddell is there, because they have Dean Evison, I have them a bit higher on my list. I just want to fully see that they can execute this said plan overall. I haven't been impressed with Johnny Gaudreau since he signed with Columbus. I want to see if he can do a little bit better. And I also want to see them add some more, NHL talent overall. I know they have a lot of very good young players, but I want to see how those players develop as well. And I'm just curious to see how this rebuild goes for them too. 18, I also do have the Toronto Maple Leafs just because I think their window is just these next main 2 to 3 years. I think at the end of those 2 to 3 years, Nick, just because of their core contracts, I think it's going to start at least closing a little bit. And I think some over teams even behind them will start passing them a little bit. So I think if Toronto wants to win, it has to be right now. After them, similar spot with the Rangers. I think the Rangers are going to be a really good team this year and next year. But I also know they have the Igor Shesterkin contract coming. That's going to take up a lot of their cap space. Some of their other players with the core are getting a bit older as well. So I'm just not fully sure I see them as a contender 3 to 4 to 5 years down the line. And also I think the jury is still out a little bit on Chris Drury. I want to see what he can do to follow up this past year.
Hunter and I are going to take one more quick break, and then we are going to rattle off the rest of our list. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On NHL. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Thursday afternoon. Next up for me, I am going to go to the... I hate to do it, but I have to put the Rangers here at 16 because I'm just not very bullish on their long-term prospects. Once, whatever you pay Shesterkin, you're going to have to take away from your depth. You're going to have to pay K'Andre Miller. You're going to have to pay Alexis Lafreniere. Panarin is 32. Kreider is 31. Zibanejad is 30. Trocheck is 32. Once that group of forwards ages out, there is not an army of reinforcements on their way. More likely than not, the Rangers will have one of Gabriel Perreault, Brennan Othmann in that group be something. I don't think any of those guys is a building block type player. Maybe the salary cap makes a big leap and the Rangers are able to find a way to make it all work, but I don't really see a world where they can do that. After the Rangers, I have Ottawa. I like their young guys. As Hunter said, I want to echo his sentiments tenfold. I really am high, especially on their defensive prospects. I really like Jake Sanderson. I think he's going to be somebody who replaces Thomas Chabot in the pecking order. Maybe they can turn Thomas Chabot into something else. After them, I am going to go over to Seattle. The reason I think Seattle has an opportunity to be good is they have so much cap flexibility and they have a lot of organizational depth. They don't have any superstars, but they have a ton of depth, and that's going to enable them to really that's going to enable them to make moves to stay competitive. After them, I have the Columbus Blue Jackets sitting at number 12. I think the Blue Jackets, if they finally iron out what they want to be, they can be pretty good. I am skeptical of some of the pieces. I don't know if they actually are going to get anything for Patrick Laine. As you said, Johnny Gaudreau, I got to see it. After the Blue Jackets at number 11, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. I like the Hurricanes foundational pieces. I like Aho, I like Svechnikov, I like Jarvis, I like Jack Drury. But until I see that ownership group willing to commit big money to good players, I'm going to be skeptical. I know they've paid Aho, but eventually you're going to have to keep one of these big pieces you have as opposed to letting them walk in free agency. After the Hurricanes, I have the Florida Panthers at number 10. Their core is very good, but their depth kind of worries me now. They had the championship brain drain, which is a real thing. Number 9, I have the San Jose Sharks. They are well positioned to eventually be good. They have a ton of cap space. You, of course, have Celebrini. You have Will Smith. They have drafted relatively well over the last handful of years. They have a lot of prospects. It's simply a matter of, are they going to graduate these prospects and turn them into anything?
Well, you just rattled off a good chunk of teams there, so I'm going to have to go rapid fire with mine as well. So next up on my list overall, Nick, I do have the Boston Bruins at number 16. I have them a bit higher on my list just because I think for at least the next few years, this is going to be a playoff team. Will they be a Stanley Cup contender? No, but I like Jim Montgomery as a head coach. I think Jeremy Swayman is a good enough number 1 goaltender. I like obviously Marchand, Pasternak. They added Lindholm this year. They got Zadorov, and maybe those contracts won't age that well towards the end of those contracts. But I think overall, when you look at them right now, they help, and I think they'll get them at least in the playoffs. As for them being a contender, I'm skeptical on, but I have them number 16 just because I think they're at least a bona fide playoff team for these next several seasons. Number 15, I have Nashville. I really like the job that Barry Trotz is doing. I just don't know if I see them as a true contender during this time. I think they're definitely a bona fide playoff team, especially these next couple of seasons, but I'm not sure they have what it takes to beat a fully healthy Colorado team or a fully healthy Dallas team in the playoffs. Number 14, I have Tampa Bay. I'm a bit higher on them just because I really like their management group. Julian Brisbaugh knows what he's doing down there. He also has Matthew Darsh right by his side. Kucherov continues to play really well. Vasilevsky, yes, he's a little bit older now, but I still think when you look at it, he's a top 5 goaltender in the league. And until he falls off, this is still a bona fide playoff team that has at least a chance of maybe being a contender. Tampa Bay always loves figuring out during the season. I know they have their salary cap concerns, but they always figure it out no matter what. I have them number 14, even though I think their depth concerns me at least a little bit. And then number 13, I have the Florida Panthers. I think the Panthers, they're well positioned to be a playoff team once again this year, if not a Stanley Cup contender. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, they are a Stanley Cup contender this year. But for the next 3 to 5 years, I think their window kind of starts to close a little bit. They did get gutted a little bit this offseason, but the main core guys will still be in place. As long as those guys are in place, they will still be a threat to win. Number 12, I actually have the Philadelphia Flyers. I think with Matt Michkov coming over, this team should be at least even a little bit better than they were this year. I'm not sure they're still going to be a playoff team just because I think the Eastern Conference as a whole should be better this year compared to last year, but they'll at least be in the conversation. And as for the future, the next 3 to 5 years, I think they're set up to be a bona fide playoff team. I'm not sure about contender status just yet, but I have them as a playoff team, especially with Michkov coming over. Number 11, I have Vegas. I know a little bit from now, they may not be that good, but the right now still very much matters. In Vegas, their management team, they're very ruthless. They're very aggressive. I think they're going to do enough these next couple of years to still be a Stanley Cup contender, while I still think at least being a playoff team a little bit after that. This is not a team that I think is ever fully, truly going to rebuild, Nick. So I have Vegas right after that. And then my number 10 team on my list, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. I love Eric Tulsky. I think he's going to make a fine general manager. I think they have more to get out of Sebastian Aho and Svechnikov. And I think Tulsky will also be able to get them some more high-end talent. I like the prospects that they have in their system. It's one of the better prospect pools in the NHL. And also with Marty Necas, he signed that 2-year contract. Could some cooler heads prevail there? Because if that happens, they again have a nice long-term answer for a player that I think still has a bit more to give at the NHL level. So I have Carolina 10. And then I actually have Utah number 9. I like the moves that Utah made over the summer, especially with Sergachev. But now it's a matter of getting their younger players to take a big step forward. I'm really excited about Logan Cooley, for example. I think he has a lot more to give this year. Dylan Guenther, same thing with him. I think Utah, maybe not this year their playoff team, but maybe the year after, and especially right after that, this has the makings of a bona fide playoff team. I'm super high on Utah after the moves they made this summer, and I think they have they finally have a stable owner now that will do what it takes to be a bona fide playoff team and a contender.
I agree with you in that respect. So I'm going to go as quick as I can. Number 8, I have the Colorado Avalanche. Their star players are good enough that they will drag the corpse of that group for a while. When you have Makar, Rantanen, and McKinnon, you will be competitive. It's simply a matter of if McFarland is going to be able to put the right complementary pieces around those guys. Number 7, I have Montreal. I like the long-term planning. They have put together a reasonable crop of prospects. It's simply a matter of if the prospects are going to hit, they're going to have more financial flexibility going forward as some of the bad contracts like Gallagher, like Carey Price, like Josh Anderson come off the books over the next handful of seasons. I have the Flyers after that. I think the Flyers are doing a reasonable job of accumulating assets, of building up cap space. I think you are recognized. I think the fact that they had a good season last year bodes reasonably well that they're not going to get mired in a long-term situation like Buffalo or Ottawa. After the Flyers, I go all the way up to Buffalo. I like the young guys that Buffalo has a lot. I like Dylan Cousins. I like Owen Power and Rasmus Dahlin. I like UPL. I like Devin Levy. It is simply a matter of getting the supporting cast around those guys correct. After that, I have the Chicago Blackhawks. I like the Blackhawks top end. When you have one of the guys, when you have Bedard, you get a seat at the table. Frank Nazar may or may not be something. Alex Vlasic was able to put together really good results for them last season. After that, I have the Vancouver Canucks. I think the Canucks are very well positioned to be competitive right now and into the near future with Elias Pettersson, with Quinn Hughes, with JT Miller, and most importantly, with Thatcher Demko. It's just a matter of if Thatcher Demko can stay healthy. After that, I have Edmonton. Edmonton's window is a little bit smaller than the two teams I have ahead of them, but they are going to have the best crack at it over the next 2 seasons. And by simple deduction, you can figure out number 2, I have the Dallas Stars. Number 1, I have the New Jersey Devils. The Stars, young guys, are guys. It's just a matter of how good they can get and if they're going to be able to replace, Duchesne, Pavelski, Sagan, Ben over the next handful of years. But the good thing is, as those expensive guys age out, they're going to have a lot more financial flexibility to take care of those guys. And the Devils have the best young core in hockey. When you have Jack, you have Heischer, you have Bratt, you have Timo Meier, you have Luke Hughes. It's simply a matter of, do all the pieces fit together? And how many attempts do we give this group before we say, okay, maybe we should try and trade this guy out for that guy? But at that top end, in that top 5, even top 8, I think those groups are more skewed towards 2, 3, 4 years from now, as opposed to, say, right now, other than Edmonton, of course.
Right. I think that's pretty fair. Number 8, I have the San Jose Sharks. Macklin Celebrini is going to be fully in his prime in the next couple of years. Well, not the next couple of years, but I think 3 to 5 years down the line, he'll be fully in his prime. And they'll be adding help during that time as well. I think this year they could still be bad, but after that, they'll accumulate even more prospects during Celebrini's first year. They have more prospects already coming in their own system. And I think in the next couple of years, that's when they should start making the playoffs and also adding some more NHL talent to that team. I'm super bullish on the Sharks just for the next 3 to 5 years. Number 7, I have Montreal. I think Kent Hughes has been doing a great job since taking over, and he's been acquiring assets via trade while locking up his young core, especially with Slavkovsky recently. I still think they need a little bit more help up front, but I think in 5 years, this should be, again, I'll keep saying this phrase, a bona fide playoff team, if not perhaps a potential contender. Maybe not a contender, but I think they're really set up for the future overall. Number 6, I have the Chicago Blackhawks. They should be fully contending, I think, in the next 3 to 5 years. Bedard will also be in his prime. They'll be spending more money overall. You already saw them spend a good chunk of change during free agency. You bring in a player like Teravainen, for example, you bring him back to Chicago. They also made a couple of other moves. It's now surrounding Bedard with more NHL talent. And they also have some prospects that are going to be ready in the next couple of years as well. So I really like the future for Chicago. They should be a playoff team, I think, pretty soon. Number 5, I have the Vancouver Canucks. I'm super bullish on them because they have their core locked up right now. They also have Thatcher Demko coming back healthy, and they have Artur Silovs, who's only 23 years old. In 5 years, they'll still have Pettersson, Quinn Hughes, and Thatcher Demko. And I'll say this, Niels Höglander, since he's still so young, I think he still has a lot more to give at the NHL level. We'll have to see what they decide with Brock Besser, but if they decide to extend him, he'll also be there. But I really like how aggressive their management group is. Their prospect pool, I think overall, is at least decent. They're set up pretty well, I think, for these next several years to be a playoff team and to contend. Number 4, I have Colorado. I love their front office, man. Chris McFarland and Joe Sakic, they get what it takes to be an NHL executive. The core is going to be a little bit older in the next 3 to 5 years, but I still think McKinnon and Ranson will be playing at a high level. We'll have to see what happens with Landeskog. But when it comes down to it, the Colorado front office knows how to accumulate NHL talent. They know what moves to make to surround their core. And I think they'll be able to do that while keeping the Avalanche in contention these next 3 to 5 years. Number 3, I have the Oilers mainly for roster purposes. McDavid and Draisaitl will still be very much great players. I think Bouchard is going to be great. They'll have to figure out some of their other contracts on their team, but I at least feel like, especially these next couple of seasons, they'll be a contender. And even these next 3 to 5 years, I think they'll still be a playoff team because Draisaitl and McDavid, they won't be too old at the end of that 3 to 5 year window. Number 2, the Dallas Stars. They did this entire thing, right, man? They brought their young guys up when their other core was getting a bit old, and Ben and Sagan. And look at them now, man. Jason Robertson, he's awesome. Rupe Hintz, Stan Coven's going to be a stud. Wyatt Johnston's going to be awesome. Jake Ottinger is a stud in net. Jim Nill is a great general manager, and he's going to keep them in contention. They have such a great forward group. Defensively, they're very strong. I really like the future for Dallas. And number 1, I have the New Jersey Devils. The young core all locked up. They finally have an answer and goal, hopefully with Jacob Markstrom. They'll have a little bit of money to spend over these next couple of years, and they also have a really good prospect pool, in my opinion. This should be a team that's competing for this Stanley Cup, I think, potentially as soon as this year if everything goes right. But if not this year, definitely the next year and moving forward.
I agree with you. I think the Devils are in a unique position where they locked up a lot of their core ahead of time and said, we believe in these guys. We think they're going to hit. So we're going to build out from there. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. So if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, leave us a comment. Give us your top 5 teams over the next 5 years. Whatever you take that to mean, Hunter and I will see you guys next week. Until then, later.